Well, I've got 1031 here.
Okay.
So I think what we'll do, gee, I wish we had, wanted to have more, but I'll introduce Emily to give a summary on where to turn in your money, whether in Álamos or abroad. So Emily, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm just here to give a quick 1-minute plug for the collections that are currently in process for the Álamos street sweepers and garbage collectors that we traditionally give them every Christmas. The collection was started many years ago by Dolores Parker, and we've continued it through the years, most recently with Jim Tave's help, and then last year with Pam Wagner and Penny Dubach and Lorna Acosta. And we're still collecting at this year at Lucci's and at Kathy's Corner and at Teresita's. That's where the 3 envelopes have been placed. Or if you see me on the street or can drop by the house, I can also take your donation directly. We have already gotten the list from the Palacio, and the list contains 55 names of worker bees that include the dear lady that sits in the restroom on the in the Mercado day in and day out handing out toilet paper, and the gentleman that cleans the cemetery and keeps it respectable looking throughout the year. So they will all be receiving envelopes on December 15th. So prior to that date, we'd like to have your donation dropped off or given to me. And if you are not in Álamos and would like to mail a check, US check, you can do that to Lorna Acosta. She will be up in Tucson today, tomorrow, and the 3rd, checking her mail for the final time on the 4th of December. So get the check in the mail promptly, and I have the address if you need to contact me or her directly for that information. So I don't want to waste any more time, but thank you, everybody. And you're welcome to come to the Palacio on the 15th at 11 o'clock if you would like to help with the presentation of envelopes that everybody will be receiving and signing for. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Emily. And you're not wasting time at all. I just hope that on the 15th that we get pictures so that we can get them. I'm sure someone from the city will be there. But we need to make sure that we have pictures.
Traditionally, they all hang around and they wait for that opportunity. They love that photo op when everybody can gather, and we do get a group picture. So it's a nice occasion.
That is
got a
wonderful.
Picture here from
well,
one of the
thank
other
you,
years.
Emily, for all the work that you put into it, and for all the others, Jim in the past and Dolores for starting this. Anyway, we're happy to have you all here for our December 1st meeting, and we're privileged that Pam will present to us on the early history of Mexico, going back in the 16th century. And Pam, you just don't worry about making it shorter than it needs to be, because we are ready to hear about this history.
Okay. Conquering Mexico in the 1500s, weapons and disease. Provoked by the war in Ukraine, I was reading around in the history of warfare when I found an article, The Conquest of the Americas, dealing mostly with Spanish conquests in the 15 and 1600s. The author, Patricia Seed, focuses on Spanish military technology, though she also writes a bit about the use of horses and the issue of disease and Native American mortality. In the first 100 years of Spanish empire building in Mexico, from 1520 to 1620, Old World diseases, which arrived with the Spaniards, killed 95% of the population of 25 million in the zone between San Luis Potosí and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This is the isthmus here. Common sense suggests that such a terrible shock to communities would have a bearing on their resistance to invaders. However, this is a topic very difficult to get data on. In the meantime, Patricia Seed and other historians tell us about Spanish superiority in arms as a factor in the conquest. Seed emphasizes that while the conquistadors used iron, Native Americans were iron-free and suffered from that lack in their meeting with the imperialists. We can factor in that warfare for Native Americans to begin with was not primarily about killing. Specific revenge could be a motive, and once the offenders had been captured, they might be ritually done away with. Another motive was to capture people for slave labor, not to kill them. The conquistadors played a very different, deadly war game, and Native American weapons and defensive apparel and behavior in combat would take a while to adjust. Early on, relatively few Spaniards died or were wounded in encounters, while many Americans died. It took about 50 years before Native American weaponry and tactics could change sufficiently to meet Spanish challenges. But by then, the Spanish had gained the upper hand militarily, and millions of Native Americans had died. In the account of conquest I provide here, relatively little about disease appears because it does not figure into the historical writing I found. But we can try to keep it in the back of our minds as we review the material. First, what were the weapons and defensive apparel of the Spanish? Iron, sometimes in its pure form as steel, formed the principal component of powerful swords, knives, daggers, lances, and it was a crucial element of crossbows. All of these could be used to deadly effect. Iron also formed a central part of Spanish firearms. The arquebus and the cannon. Finally, it constituted a key element of defensive devices, helmets, and metal vests and shoulder protectors. These Spaniards used to shield themselves from native weapons. The most impressive tools of war that the Spanish brought were the newest technological innovations in warfare in Europe. The arquebuses, sometimes referred to as muskets, and most importantly, cannon. The Spaniards exploited the iron edge to its limit to conquer indigenous societies rapidly before Native Americans could secure iron weapons. They also maintained control of their vast conquests, in part by continuing to keep iron weapons out of their enemies' hands. Since bearing arms was traditionally associated with aristocratic privilege, keeping weapons out of Native American hands was in part a matter of maintaining social distinction. Historically and culturally, therefore, Spanish colonists were ready to exploit the technological advantages of iron. The Spanish used horses, which were new to the Americas, but in the 1500s, because of the terrain of Mexico, fighting on horseback tended not to be the deciding factor in military engagements. What were the weapons of Americans? In most areas of Mexico, they employed only what Seed calls Stone Age technologies. Only in highland central Mexico, including today's Mexico City, Puebla, Guadalajara, and Veracruz, had indigenous technologies moved into the Bronze Age. There, people had developed military uses for metal with copper-tipped arrows and javelins. While some warriors of highland Mexico had bronze weapons, though most had only bows and arrows, shields made from local animal skins, and wooden clubs. While arrows were sometimes tipped with poison and clubs with obsidian, a glass-like substance formed by volcanic eruptions, they remained weapons made of wood that had to be slowly and painstakingly crafted with stone or wooden tools. Also, obsidian could break on contact with metal. I was sort of stunned by the article by Patricia Seed, left with the impression that such was Spanish superiority in arms and artillery that after the fight put up by the Aztecs defending their capital city in 1520-21, the Spanish could just march through 16th century Mexico, flashing their swords and firing their arquebuses, and the Americans did not have a chance. And of course, there's the mortality issue to consider. Reading further, I have found views which give a more nuanced picture of the military engagements, including the work of Hugh Thomas. As conquistadors spread out from the newly named Mexico City in 1521, they wanted to seize land that they could claim as encomiendos. These were not feudal estates, but the right to the labor of Americans living on these lands and to their tribute. Indications are that conquistadors wanted landed estates, but Hernando Cortés, their leader, did not allow that, most likely under instructions from the royal court in Spain. The overwhelming initial goal of the conquistadors was to acquire wealth enough, precious metals and gems, to return to Spain with the capacity to raise their social standing, to increase their honor and status. Spanish society was possibly the most hierarchical and unbalanced in Western Europe in the 1500s. With very little manufacturing and a small banking and commercial sector, society was mainly divided between, on the one hand, landowning elites of different ranks of nobility who did not have to pay taxes to the royal government, and on the other, peasants who the royal administration squeezed to get the resources to run the kingdom and pay for royal Spanish engagements in Europe and the Mediterranean. The conquistadors were mostly from the lesser nobility. The fortune-hunting conquistadors were small in number, but from the very beginning, under the leadership of Cortés, they were skillful in finding enemies of the groups they wanted to attack and making them military allies. For example, take the exploits of Cortés's most successful conquistador, Gonzalo de Sandoval. His force was met by bowmen of a local ruler as Sandoval aimed to set up a settlement on the Caribbean coast. He and his men were, though, able to establish a small place which he named Espiritu Santo. Sandoval divided the newly conquered land among 5 other followers of Cortés, including Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who later gained fame as a historian of the conquest of Mexico. Sandoval's men did not have an easy time of it. They would approach several pueblos where they assumed there would be friendly Native Americans, of course, on their terms, including an offer of becoming the vassals of Charles I, King of Spain. Often they were attacked. Diaz del Castillo was wounded in the throat. One conquistador in the group returned to Mexico City to ask for help from Cortés, who sent him back with 30 soldiers. In the spring of 1523, having assured himself of the subservience of the area around Espiritu Santo, Sandoval and his friends set out to conquer what is today's Chiapas. The force consisted of only 27 horsemen, 15 bowmen, 8 musketeers, and a gunner with a cannon. They led 70-foot soldiers and more than that number of Native American allies. There was a good deal of sporadic fighting against the Chiapanix, who were armed with fire-hardened javelins and bows and arrows, as well as long lances with cutting edges. The Chiapanix had good cotton armor, plumes, and sheathed wooden swords called mancanas. They had slings for stones and lassos for catching horses. They sometimes used burning pitch against their enemies. A battle took place 12 miles from San Cristobal, which became the capital of Chiapas. There were, however, few Spanish casualties. 2 Spanish foot soldiers and 4 horses were killed. 1 conquistador was wounded. All were felled by bows and arrows. Assisted in crossing the Chiapas River by Xaltepec Indians, who were enemies of the Chiapanix, the Spanish forces surrounded the town of Chiapas. They summoned the chiefs of the town and asked them to give tribute to King Charles, which they did. And the force went on to conquer Chamula, though that siege was more difficult. This narrative of Sandoval and his force illustrates relatively quick conquests of territory. Hugh Thomas also writes of the 7-year effort of Francisco Montejo to conquer the Yucatan. Montejo failed in this endeavor between 1526 and 1534. He was an accomplished conquistador with experience in Panama and New Spain. Montejo was unusual among the conquistadors in that he was more interested in the proceeds of productive agriculture and manufacturing than precious metals, and he saw possibilities in the environment of the Yucatan. For example, the Yucatan Mayas were skillful makers of good textiles. However, the Mayan political structure presented challenges different from that of the Aztec Empire. The Mayans' polity was decentralized with different independent political units, not the kind of central organization of the Aztecs. With a centralized kingdom, once the royal leadership was overthrown and the capital city was taken, the kingdom could be more easily conquered. In the Yucatan, the presence of a lot of chiefs and kings made conquest more difficult, even though Montejo and his men had iron weapons and horses. When the Spaniards fought and finally overcame one leader and his force, there were others to contend with. The fact that Montejo's men did not find precious metals and the gemstones that they wanted meant that over the years of fighting, it was difficult to maintain morale. When the silver discoveries in Peru became known, Montejo could not hold together what was left of his force. Furthermore, Mayan weapons presented a challenge, even if they were mostly Stone Age. They had strong bows, more straight than curved, flint-tipped arrows, lances, and darts, and swords of hard wood with razor-sharp flakes of obsidian, which could inflict serious wounds. The arrows, made from reeds growing in lagoons, were often 5 palms long. The bowstrings were made successfully from the local hemp. They also had little copper hatchets. These could be used as weapons and for working wood. As for defense, the Mayans had shields made of carefully woven reeds, lined with deerskin. They had jackets of quilted cotton. A few lords had wooden helmets. The last independent and unconquered kingdom of the Yucatan did not fall until 1697, more than 160 years later. But 16th century encounters were not just between separate groups. There were at least 2 major military developments among resisting Native Americans. The first was the Mixton War between 1540 and 1542. This consisted of more or less set battles, where the Spaniards and their allies faced indigenous armies numbering in the thousands. The Caxcan people were at the center of the resistance. They lived in what was considered at the time to be the north of New Spain, the Spanish Empire in Mexico. Caxcanes were found in the southern part of Jalisco, southern Zacatecas, and Aguas Calientes. They were a sedentary people, depending on agriculture and living in permanent towns and settlements. Also important in the war were Zacatecos from Zacatecas. The rebellion was probably provoked by the brutality of many area encomenderos, owners of encomiendas. There was also much brutality attached to work in the mines. The spark setting off the war was apparently the arrest of 18 rebellious leaders and the hanging of 9 of them. As the war progressed, resentment was expressed against the attempts of Franciscan friars to erase indigenous beliefs and customs. Antonio de Mendoza, the first viceroy of New Spain, thought that the rebellion was by the wild Chichimeca Indians even further north with a new religion brought to them, quote, by messengers of the devil. There were religious elements in the rebellion. In the run-up to the war, former rulers and some of their families assembled on a sacred hill and revived their ancient religious practices, including human sacrifice. Among the leaders of the rebels was the Coxcon Francisco Tenochtitlan from Zacatecas. He'd been baptized a Catholic and given the name Francisco. He became known as the Lord Tlatoani of Notizlan, an urban center and region of southern Zacatecas. Tlatoani was the indigenous name for a high-ranking leader. Tenochtitlan led forces in the burning of churches and a convent. Christian Indians were made to do penance for the time they'd been Christians, washing their heads to free themselves from the memory of the cross. 3 friars were killed. When the initial Spanish force against the rebels was repulsed, Viceroy Mendoza realized that the rebellion could become colony-wide, and hastened to Guadalajara, from where he sent out a peace mission. When that failed, he decided that a bigger force needed to be assembled. Cristobal de Oñate, the founder of Guadalajara, was sent out with 50 horsemen against the Meekstone camp. The rebels fought well, and 13 Spaniards were killed along with 6 African slaves and a large number of Indian allies. This battle was a signal for many further revolts. The continuing threat persuaded the viceroy to assemble an even bigger force, including one of the famous Spanish heroes of New Spain, Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was called back along with another conquistador from a planned journey of discovery in the Pacific. With 100 horsemen and an equal number of foot soldiers, the two made for Guadalajara and warded off the rebel advance on that city. Viceroy Mendoza then decided to send 100 men from Mexico City, and he ordered also another force from Michoacan. Back in Guadalajara, there was a meeting under Cristobal de Oñate's direction to form a plan of action. Pedro de Alvarado, impatient to return to his voyage of discovery, and impatient in nature in the first place, told his colleagues that they were children in their timidity, and he declared that with his experience, he would soon personally defeat these Indians. Oñate sought to dissuade Alvarado, but the latter reminded his comrades of their lack of experience in comparison with his. Refusing Oñate's offers of military support and not waiting for the support coming from Mexico City, he set off for the hill of Nochislan. 15,000 Mixtone rebel warriors awaited him under the leadership of Tenochtitlan and a Zacateco named Don Diego. Alvarado had with him only 100 foot soldiers, 100 horsemen, and several hundred indigenous allies. First, he sought to negotiate his enemy's surrender. Then he mounted a direct assault, which was repelled with losses. Alvarado rallied, and his infantry attacked without the help of the cavalry. The rebels fought them with great force. Alvarado tried unsuccessfully to rally his men again and dismounted to prevent a headlong retreat. It was raining and the ground had become a bog. Alvarado led his horse backwards, but his Spanish secretary, who was with him, slipped, and Alvarado was flung into a ravine with his horse on top of him. This is an indigenous representation of the death of Alvarado. Oñate, watching from a nearby hillock, saved the day for the Spaniards and carried the wounded Alvarado back to Guadalajara, where he died 10 days later. A force of 50,000 Mixtone rebel warriors besieged Guadalajara and were beaten off with difficulty. They returned to Nochislan and other strong points. Viceroy Mendoza sent a judge to report on the situation in Guadalajara, and he said that Mendoza himself must come with a force. Even though Mendoza's limited military experience was long in the past, such was Spanish aristocratic code, it was assumed that a Mendoza from the highest ranks of Spanish nobility could automatically command men in battle. And Mendoza passed this, the greatest test of his viceroyalty. He set out for Guadalajara with 180 horsemen, a large number of indigenous allies, perhaps several thousand, and a good quantity of cannon, relatively new to warfare in New Spain. Mendoza traveled to Michoacan, where he easily defeated the indigenous forces at a fortress near Cuina. Mendoza seems to have felt that it was important to make an example of the captured. He condemned them to death or slavery. Some were placed in a line and blown to pieces by cannon. Others were torn to pieces by dogs, and others still were handed over to African slaves to be stabbed to death. After this repression, Mendoza was able to negotiate peace at the next three Mixton military sites he traveled to. He moved on to Nochislan, the domain of Tenemos. When a truce could not be secured, Mendoza settled down to a siege, cutting off the town's supply of water and battering down resistance with artillery. The Mixton offered peace, but Mendoza chose to launch an assault and triumphed. Tenematzli was captured, but he escaped and remained at large as a guerrilla until 1550. Now, down here in the bottom left-hand corner is an indigenous representation of Tenematzli with an arrow, bow and arrow, and Mendoza with his sword. Mendoza then moved on to the Mixton fortress. Mixton was a hill in Zacatecas, which served as an indigenous stronghold. After an offer of peace was rejected, Mendoza spent 3 weeks besieging the fortress. Daily proposals of peace were followed by daily assaults of artillery. Finally, a group of indigenous warriors on the fortress hill deserted and revealed the way to the top of the hill. The fortress fell while, as Hugh Thomas put it, the Viceroy's horsemen made their presence powerfully felt on the summit. I suppose that means there was a slaughter. Thousands of indigenous people were dragged off in chains to the mines, and many survivors, mostly women and children, were transported to work on encomiendas. One more Mixton stronghold was taken, and the war was over in 1542. It had lasted 2 years. Another type yet of military engagement between the forces of the Spanish Empire and Native Americans was the Chichimeca War between 1550 and 1590, 40 years. It has been called the longest and most expensive military campaign in Mesoamerica. The Chichimeca Confederation was established on the central Mexican plateau with the Bajío as its epicenter. The Bajío includes parts of Jalisco, Guanajuato, Querétaro, and Aguascalientes. This war was different from the Mixton War. Rather than Native Americans consisting of thousands of warriors, rather than Native American armies consisting of thousands of warriors attacking the Spaniards and their allies, the warriors of the Chichimecas fought in groups ranging from 5 to 200. Silver had been discovered in Zacatecas in 1546, and it quickly turned into an area where great fortunes might be made in mining. Spaniards moved north, attracted by the possibilities. These mining activities and the town and settlements that grew up around them took place north of the settled agricultural societies in New Spain. The activities and the communities of miners and their families had then to be provisioned, and caravans supplied them. The Chichimeca nations of the area resented the intrusions by the Spanish on their lands. Add to this that Spanish soldiers soon began raiding native territory, trying to acquire slaves for the mines. To supply and communicate with the mines in and near Zacatecas, new roads were built from Querétaro and Jalisco across Chichimeca lands. The caravans full of goods along the roads became targets for Chichimeca warriors. The Chichimecas were nomadic and semi-nomadic people and lived by hunting and gathering. They used little clothing and wore their hair long and tattooed their bodies. The Confederation consisted of 4 main nations which had decentralized governments. The nomadic nature of the Chichimeca society made it difficult for the Spanish to defeat them. The Chichimeca were very mobile and experts in dealing with rough terrain, finding hiding spots. The bow was their principal weapon, and they were skilled archers. Chichimeca bows were short, less than 4 feet long. Their arrows were long and thin, made of reed and tipped with obsidian rock sharper than a modern-day razor. The arrows had excellent penetrating qualities, even against the type of Spanish armor, in that the obsidian tips could penetrate links of chainmail. In one account, 50 Zacateca warriors killed 200 Spanish soldiers in a battle. Chichimecan use of food native to the area gave them far greater mobility than the sedentary invaders. These were tied to domesticated livestock, agriculture, and imported supplies. The Chichimeca could and did cut off these supplies, destroy the livestock, as illustrated in this representation here, and thus paralyze the economic and military vitality of the invaders. When they attacked, some of them used a tactic that terrified the animals and scared the Spanish. The warriors would disguise themselves as grotesque animals, using animal heads and paint, and then they yelled like crazed beasts, making the Spanish lose control of horses and livestock. The Spanish started to set up many forts, bought mercenaries, and tried to use as many slaves as they could. By the end of 1561, it was estimated that more than 4,000 Spaniards and their native allies had been killed by the Chichimecas. Prices for imported food and other commodities in Zacatecas had doubled or tripled due to the dangers of transporting goods to the city. In the 1570s, the rebellion spread as Chichimeca warriors began raiding near Querétaro. To protect the roads, the Spanish created a dozen new presidio forts, staffed by Spanish soldiers and native ally soldiers, and encouraged more Spanish people to settle in new areas, including what would be the nucleus of the future cities of Celaya, León, Aguascalientes, and San Luis Potosí. The viceroy of New Spain, Conde de Corona, wrote to the Spanish king, Philip II, in April 1581, quote, "I have let the royal court understand about the happenings with the Chichimeca war and about how dire the situation is with the mines in those districts where the natives are engaging in battle, and with such a great number that many mines in Zacatecas are closed. To end the conflict, the Spanish began to change public policy to purchase peace from the Chichimeca and assimilate with them. In 1581, the Bishop of Guadalajara made a proposal for a, quote, Christian remedy to the war, the establishment of new towns with priests, soldiers, and friendly Indians to gradually Christianize the Chichimecas. The Viceroy, Alvaro Manrique de Zuniga, followed this idea in 1586 with a policy of removing many Spanish soldiers from the frontier, as they were considered more a provocation than a remedy. The Viceroy opened negotiations with Chichimeca leaders and negotiated tools, food, clothing, and land to encourage them through, quote, gentle persuasion. He forbade further military operations. In keeping with the varied ecology, societies, cultures of New Spain, military encounters between the invaders and resisting Native Americans varied in scale and intensity. We have seen here 4 different kinds of military engagements: relatively rapid Spanish success over small groups, the Spanish being slowed down in the Yucatan by relatively well-armed warriors from well-organized small polities, set battles involving thousands of native fighters, and long-term small group native assaults on Spanish commercial arteries. As we think about the outcomes in favor of the Spanish, certainly their swords, guns, and cannon must be kept in mind. There is, however, the terrible loss of native population, and with it, indigenous culture and society on a large scale. It seems that not much in the way of knowledge about this catastrophe has turned up as yet. For historians are dependent for sources on what the invaders themselves wrote about the illnesses and deaths of the people they sought to subdue. The dying, not surprisingly, seem not to have left much of a record. Native mortality worked in favor of Spanish military aims. Commenting on it in detail at the time would have diminished what the conquistadors saw as their glorious conquests. But maybe scholars just have to dig harder in the archives to provide us with observations from, for example, men from the religious orders, like the Franciscans and later the Jesuits. However, not only can we imagine that this ghastly mortality affected indigenous morale and military mobilization, the loss may go some way to explaining the eventual success of the religious orders in securing widespread conversion to the religion of the invaders. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pam. I learned so much that I didn't know, and I'm sure the rest of us did as well. And
Yes, brief things.
I had always thought that after Cortez came, the Native Americans just kind of gave up. But you've shown us all about the wars and everything. So I appreciate that, Pam. Well, anyway, what questions do you have for Pam?
Okay, I will say that I got from my mother the early 17th century memoir of a Jesuit missionary in southern Sonora and northern Sinaloa. And he does, this was an English translation which was abridged. And he does mention a little bit about the mortality, but not in much detail at all, very little.
Yeah.
But it makes me think that going through all the records, which the Franciscans, the Dominicans, I forget what the third one group was, and then the Jesuits, they might find more. And this has probably been done, and maybe it's been written in Spanish, but I haven't yet found it in English representations of this period.
Mhm. Well, we know there was a great amount of disease and smallpox and whatever else that anyway came, and there was no resistance by the people in what is now Mexico. And you know, it's a cruel kind of history, but then a lot of history is, you know, all over the world. There's a great amount of cruelty involved.
Yeah, and we see that in the war in the Ukraine. That's why I started reading about warfare. I was thinking, why do human beings do this to each other? It's complicated, of course.
Right, it is. I have a question about, you mentioned on the conquistadors, were many of them of the lower class Spanish, or
Well, they were lower nobility. They were nobility,
they were
but they were
nobility?
lower nobility.
Okay, so just a poor Spanish person couldn't join up. See, I somehow thought that they went to the New World to gain riches and gold and all that.
Well, sure, because they were younger sons and they were poor nobility, and the only way to rise in that very hierarchical, very status conscious, honor obsessed society was to come back with lots of riches and buy land if possible and join the higher ranks.
Now, you said that Cortez wouldn't allow them to purchase or to
establish feudal estates, yeah. They could
Okay.
only get rights to the labor of people who lived on the land, and they demanded tribute from them. You know, like any riches they may have, like agricultural production, like any textiles they might produce, stuff like that.
Oh, okay. Well, this is all so interesting, and I know traveling through that center of Mexico, where all of this in the Zacatecas, Guanajuato area, where many of the battles were fought. It's just very interesting. Other questions, people?
Well, just a comment about the disease. Covering a little later time period, there's an author who wrote a book about smallpox and effect mostly on the American Revolution, but she does have a chapter or two on Mexico at that time, including the effect of smallpox is what she's focusing on. And she did a statistical analysis of like the parish burial records, and to see that she could see big spikes, you know, here and then, you know, when there may have been a report somewhere about smallpox. But of course, the burial records don't say, oh, they died of smallpox, but she could see spikes in the numbers.
Yeah.
For example, when the group who went to colonize California went from Sonora across to Baja, Mexico, they apparently brought smallpox with them to Baja, and she could see some spikes there. And they stayed in Baja for a while, and then when people were recovered, they went on up to California. But so there's been at least one person who did some analysis looking at the statistical records about disease, but that's a later time period, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I recently finished a book which I read after I wrote most of this presentation, called 1491. And Roger Lewis told me about this book a long time ago, and I bought it, but then it got lowered pushed lower down on my books of priority. But then I was talking to another friend on Zoom shortly before I came back to Alamos, and he had just read it and he was recommending it. So I pulled the book out, I brought it with me to Alamos, and if you're interested in this issue of Indigenous society before Columbus, and also specifically very much so mortality and issues of mortality, including the genetic breakdown of Native peoples in the Americas. This book by Charles Mann is the book for you. It was first published about 2004, 2005, and then he did a second edition in 2011. And it's really fascinating. And it's tragic. It breaks your heart to read it.
Yeah. Well, I'm ready to read it there. I'm going to look for it. And the last name again, Mann, M-A-N?
M-A-N-N.
Okay.
1491.
1491. Well, that's an easy title to remember.
Right.
But yeah, we need to research more on this area of disease through the conquest anyway, and there probably are, there is information if we look for it anyway.
I have
Well,
a question.
yeah, question, Melanie.
Hi, Pam. Do you know what the Spanish were doing in Central America and South America? Were they fighting all over the whole continent, or were they mostly in Mexico?
They also set up a viceroy in Peru, the viceroy of Peru, which included more than today's Peru, and also in South America. In fact, in North and South America, all in all, Charles Mann argues, with quoting other scholars, 95% of the population was wiped out.
Oh. And also, my brother recommended this book to me 20, 30 years ago, The Account of All Things Yucatan by the Friar Diego de Lend.
Oh, wow.
And it was
Great.
written between
Yeah.
1563 and 1572.
Oh, wow.
I can share this with you. It's
Yeah,
got
thanks.
a lot of Mayan glyphs and the whole, you know,
Mhm.
lived with them and made a diary. So it's
Oh,
like,
great. Thank you. I think I'll borrow that from you if you don't mind.
sure,
Yes.
sure. Do you know how Mexico became separate from Central? I mean, how did they divide up Mexico to be the boundaries that it has today?
No, why
Guatemala.
Guatemala emerged as a separate state? I'm not sure. It's just, I'm sure it's something to do with the local politics at the time. For example, in North America, we ended up with 13 different colonies, which
Right.
only with extreme effort ended up being one single state, but took a lot of negotiation. So why Guatemala and Mexico share that boundary, I don't know.
The South American story, Melanie, when you were saying with the conquest of the Incas is just as sad,
Mhm.
as the conquest of the Americas, the North American.
So they
Well, other questions? We've got about 5 minutes. If you have another question,
Or comment, you don't have to
Comment.
question, you can comment.
yeah. And I know next week's meeting will be there at the Hacienda, and during the meet and greet, all of you that are there in Álamos that can go, please mention it to people. I want Trini to have an audience of people as he talks about his mass collection. So I'm hoping as many as possible can go to that. And I will communicate with Roberto about the video there of that meeting. And then on the 15th, I know Stephanie's putting together the tour that we had originally planned today. And thank you, Pam, for moving your presentation forward. This has just been wonderful, and we sure appreciate it.
Mhm.
Well, thank
Are there
you.
Yeah, are there other comments? And if not, why, I guess we'll close the meeting, but I thank all of you that participated. I will get this, hopefully this afternoon, I'll get it on YouTube so that we can all watch it again and take notes a second time. Okay.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank
Yeah,
you, Pam.
Thank you very much,
Sure.
Pam, and thank
Thanks
you
for
all.
listening.
Thanks, Errol.
Okay,
Thank you,
and I
Al,
will
right.
end the meeting then. Goodbye, goodbye.
Okay, bye-bye.